12 different tiles.
Yeah.
Can
12 by 6 glass,
make you
mosaic
co-host?
12 by 12.
Can you let people in?
Then we have white
Keller, can I
ice
make you
4 by
co-host, let
12,
people in, yeah?
6 by 12 glass, 12 by 12 mosaic, white ice 6 by 12, 6 by 12 glass. Carrera for the niche.
Okay. Okay, so let's get started. Welcome everybody. Thank you very much for attending. I hope that this provides some sort of an understanding of what the situation is. I know that a lot of people are confused. Okay, so let's get started right away, and we're going to start with first introduction as to what we're going to be covering today. So we're going to first talk about how we got here. How did we get to this situation where we're finding ourselves with rocket fire, riots, protests, and fires, and just about anything that you could imagine is happening. What is actually happening now? That's our next question. What's actually happening? A lot of us are confused as to what is actually going on, and what can we expect without trying to sound like a prophet or somebody somebody that can see into the future. But what can we expect going forward? So those are the three topics that we're going to try to cover today. Okay, so so let's get moving here. The first thing is, how did we get here? Okay, how did we get to this situation? So it's important to recognize that unlike a lot of times that there's disturbances in the world, there isn't one factor that got us here. There isn't one thing that we can point to and say, oh, the reason why we're having all of this chaos and all of this trouble with the Arabs and with the Palestinians is because of this one incident or this one point of contention. That is definitively not true. This was a lot of different catalysts coming together, a lot of different things that led to these problems. Okay, but in order to figure out what it is that got us here,
okay, do you guys want to listen to real?
Why now? Why is it that now this happened? What changed this month? Why didn't this happen a month ago? Why didn't this happen last year? What is it about right now that created all of these different forms of tension at once? So the first thing a lot of people will look at, they say, well, it's Arabs and Palestinians rioting against Israelis and Jews, so therefore it must be part of the overall Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That must be the big catalyst. That must be the big cause as to what's happening. And the answer is that's actually most probably not true. Now, again, this is my opinion. This is my analysis of it, but also based on the experts that I've been reading, that it's not based on just one thing that occurred, and it's not just based on Israel and the Palestinians together. The first thing that happened right away, most recently, is the Palestinian elections. There were supposed to be Palestinian elections, and they got pushed off. The excuse that Mahmoud Abbas, who's been the head of the Palestinian Authority, the president of the Palestinian Authority now for 15 years without elections, and it was supposed to be a 4-year term. He was supposed to have elections 9 years ago and has constantly pushed them off or just not even scheduled them, was the fact that Israel would not allow Palestinians that live in East Jerusalem to vote in the election, to vote in the Palestinian election. Israel's position is that they live in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is not Palestinian territory. Palestinians claim that East Jerusalem is theirs, and therefore any Arab, when we're talking about 250,000 Arabs, any Arabs that live there should be able to vote in Palestinian elections. Chances are that wasn't really the issue. The issue that we're finding is that Hamas was, according to polls, was probably going to win the election. And if Hamas was going to win the election, that means that they would be controlling not only Gaza, but they would begin to control this area here, Judea and Samaria, Yehuda and Shomron, and what the world calls the West Bank. So they would begin to have that. By pushing off the elections indefinitely, not that he delayed the elections and the elections are going to happen at some other later period of time, by pushing off the elections indefinitely, Hamas now cannot have any influence here. It robbed Hamas of the ability of taking over and having power. So now Hamas has to show its influence some other way. That's the first point of tension that's occurring. It's not actually between the Israelis and the Palestinians. It's actually between the Palestinian Authority, Fatah, and Hamas. So that's point number one to keep in mind as to what's different now than a month ago and why this violence happens. Not because of Israel versus Palestinians, but rather internally within the Palestinians. Another factor to keep in mind that's different is that the Palestinians used to be the central cause of the entire Arab world. And they've sort of taken a back seat. The Abraham Accords saw 4 Arab countries normalize relations, make peace, however you want to describe it, with Israel, and simply say that now Palestine isn't really the biggest issue to us. We're not really worried about Palestinians. There are other factors. We have to look at ourselves first. And that worried the Palestinians, because if the Arab world isn't paying attention to them, then really nobody's going to be paying attention to them anymore. So they had to step up and they had to go ahead and show that they are still focused. They have to do something to bring the world in, and we'll explain what that is in a minute. Why the Abraham Accords were signed months ago. So why now? Because we just saw an Arab party in the Israeli Knesset make that same calculation. The Ra'am party, led by Mansour Abbas, no relation to Mahmoud Abbas, made that same calculation and said, we're no longer going to consider Palestinians as our number one cause. We have to look out for ourselves. We have to look out for our issues, what's important to us. And therefore, we're going to look at what's good for Israeli Arabs, jobs, economy, our healthcare, education for ourselves, getting more civil services from Israel. So now the Palestinians have to do something to force Israeli Arabs to say, no, you know what? Actually, the Palestinians are our biggest issue. Another internal battle is within Hamas itself. There are 2 leaders of Hamas who, unless you're really reading into Hamas, you're not going to ever have heard of them, Deif and Sinwar. I might be mispronouncing their names. These are 2 military leaders within Hamas. And these 2 people are having an internal struggle over the leadership of Hamas. What's fascinating, you might say, well, come on, that's too deep down into Hamas. If you were on the Temple Mount yesterday, I wasn't there. If you were on the Temple Mount yesterday, or like me, just watched videos about the chants at the Temple Mount, you might imagine the chants at the Temple Mount were like they were on Saturday night, which said "Bomb Tel Aviv." You might imagine that they're pro-Hamas chants or "Kill the Jew" chants. They weren't. The chants were, "We are all Deif. We are all this leader of Hamas that's trying to take over from Sinwar. He's much more extremist, much more violent, and is calling for much more violence." So this internal Hamas struggle, which has really nothing to do with Israel, is another huge factor. Another factor that's different now than a couple of weeks ago is Ramadan. Ramadan is the holiest period in the Muslim calendar, and Ramadan obviously does not call for violence. But now that we're in Ramadan and towards the last days of Ramadan, tensions are higher. Fundamentalists within the Islamic movement are going to use these holy days as a way of building tension and creating moments of tension that can lead to violence. Traditionally, they've tried to do that. Some years they're successful, and thankfully most years they're not. But when you have a number of different factors together, it's very easy for them to use these last couple of days of Ramadan to stoke the flames of religious fervor and try to get Muslims to act in a violent way, especially on the Temple Mount. And since that began happening, we saw violence a couple of weeks ago at the Damascus Gate, Shar Shechem in Jerusalem's old city. There's been violence, and that was stoked again when Israel shut down Shar Shechem and shut down Damascus Gate and didn't let the traditional prayers that Muslims have had during Ramadan there. That angered a lot of Muslims. It started violence. Israel then stepped it up a notch by not allowing on Saturday afternoon. It didn't allow Muslims to come down to the Temple Mount, which was a big a tradition for them I think it's the 27th day of Ramadan, to come down and spend the night at the Temple Mount, and the Israeli forces would not allow them to. That just raised tensions even more. And lastly, what the world likes to say that this is all about, but it's a complete lie, is a legal battle in a neighborhood of Jerusalem, which is called Sheikh Jarrah. A lot of people like to call it Shimon HaTzadik neighborhood. It's a neighborhood in East Jerusalem, about 20 minutes from where I'm standing. It's a great shortcut away from a busy highway in Israel if you want to cut through things, right across the street from Hebrew University on Mount Scopus. And Sheikh Jarrah is constantly, there are houses under legal battles from them. So that's some of the so these legal battles were coming to a head. There was supposed to be a decision by Israel's Supreme Court about whether or not the Arab families, some of the Arab families that live in these homes would be evicted or not. And it looked like the decision was that these homes did belong to Jews before 1948, and any Arabs living in them really did not have a right to live in them without the Jewish owner's permission. They were given to them by the Jordanians during the period of time between 1948 and 1967 when Israel didn't control East Jerusalem, and that raised tensions even more. So that's what you're seeing in terms of different factors that occurred now that were not occurring earlier. Okay, and that's how we got there. Okay, going on now to ask the question of what's actually happening right now. Okay, so what's actually happening right now? So the first thing that's happening, and it could seem like meshing it all together, that every single thing is connected, and they are connected, but they're also separate incidences. Okay, so the first thing is Jerusalem protests at the Temple Mount. Here you see behind me the Temple Mount, and you could see just how large the courtyard is in the Temple Mount. You could fit about between 150 and if it's really crowded, 300,000 Arabs in this open courtyard here on the Temple Mount. And it's a place that unfortunately has become, it's supposed to be the place of the Beit HaMikdash, was supposed to be a place of peace. It's unfortunately over and over become a place of violence. And that's what's happening now. The protests in the Temple Mount are generally don't happen. When they do, it's always over one factor. And this is something that Ambassador David Friedman used to speak about regularly when he was the American ambassador to Israel. And that is that Arabs generally do not create mass violence. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people creating violence unless they are convinced that Israel is about to take over the Temple Mount, destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque. Okay, Al-Aqsa, by the way, just in case you don't know, is not the Gold Dome. Al-Aqsa is actually this mosque. You can see the gray dome here. It's actually this building. This is more of a shrine than a mosque. Okay, but when people think, when the Arabs think that the Jews are about to take this over, then they begin to have violence. Now you'd say, well, when do the Jews try to take it over? The answer is never, but leaders are always able to pass that off as an excuse either to distract or to cause people to want to create violence. And that's the rumor going around now, that Israel is going to take over Sheikh Jarrah and then is going to take over the Temple Mount. That starts violence. That's why Ambassador Friedman used to say that he wasn't worried about violence on the Arab streets when they moved the United States Embassy from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, because it had nothing to do with the Temple Mount, and it was impossible to connect it to the Temple Mount. And that's why he said he wasn't worried about violence, and he was right. When America recognized the Golan, anything that America would do never really created violence for that very reason. Okay, so that's one thing that's happening. Our protests on the Temple Mount, they have gotten violent. They've thrown Molotov cocktails, which are somewhat like handheld bombs. They've thrown rocks, boulders. If you see pictures from inside the mosque today, you will see that they have piles of, these are not rocks. Rocks, you imagine, are the size of a small ball. Okay, these are not rocks; they're boulders. They're very large boulders, and that's the riots that you have going on here. The next thing that you have is rocket fire from Hamas, which is obviously much more dangerous than the rioting on the Temple Mount. We've had over 1,000 rockets fired. It's important to make note of the fact that Hamas in Gaza is firing these rockets, and they are aiming them at civilians. Okay, that's very important to recognize. Hamas is not aiming its rockets at military targets and missing. They are aiming at civilians. Their goal is to kill as many civilians and to damage as many civilians as possible. Now, Hamas rockets are a lot more sophisticated than they used to be in previous years. Okay, in previous years they were very, very basic type of a metal tube with some gunpowder, explosives on the warhead on the top. fired off without much ability to aim them in the proper direction, and they a lot of times they would miss their targets, and it wasn't something that was really a very dangerous threat. The rocket technology that they're using is a lot better than it used to be. At the same time, 50% of their rockets still fall within Gaza. They never make it out of Gaza. And we've seen this year already, Palestinian sources have already announced that the deaths that you see of children inside of Gaza have not necessarily come from Israeli missiles, but they've rather come from Hamas rockets that fell short and fell into Gaza, killing their own people, which is a tragedy. The next thing that Hamas is trying to do is they're trying, and you can see in this picture, multiple rockets being launched at once. While it used to be 1, 2, maybe 3 rockets launched at the same time, because the Iron Dome system can knock out easily 10, 15 rockets at any given time. What Hamas's strategy has been, and clearly over the last couple of years, has been to set up a number of different rocket installations that have hundreds of rockets ready to go in a second's notice. Okay, they're not an army. They don't have the technology, these massive batteries that they're able to fire so many rockets. So they set all of these up ahead of time, ready for the battle that's coming, that's happening right now. By sending so many at once, the Iron Dome, which even today is still 90% successful over the last 3 days, has been 90% successful at being able to knock down rockets that are about to enter into residential areas. If it's going to enter into a field where nobody's in this field, or it's going to enter into an uninhabited area, so the Iron Dome doesn't fire rockets at it. But it's 90% successful at hitting rockets that it identifies or should identify as about to hit into a residential area. That's not 100%, which is why we've seen rockets hit buildings, we've seen people die. The idea of sending hundreds of rockets at one time, Hamas's idea of doing this, is that they're able to confuse the Iron Dome system, and by being able to confuse the Iron Dome system with so many rockets, some can get through. That's what they've been trying to do. Okay, let's go on to the next thing here. Okay, the next thing that's happening is Arab-Israeli riots. Now, it's important to note you have inside of Israel, you have Palestinians and you have Arab Israelis. Okay, the difference between them is Israeli citizenship. Palestinians live in what the world calls the West Bank, what we like to refer to as Yehuda v'Shomron. Arabs live inside of what we call mainland Israel, within the outside the green lines. They live in cities like Yaffo and Ramla, and those are Israeli cities. Now, most Arab citizens of Israel, and there are over 2 million citizens of Israel that are Arabs, live inside of their own villages that are exclusively Arab. Jews don't live. There are a few cities that have traditionally prided themselves of having integration between Arabs and Israelis, where they get along fine, they live in the same cities, and it's all been fine. It's all been hunky-dory. They all get along. Everything is fine. You even have Arab Israelis that serve in the IDF. That happens, right? We do have this idea of everybody getting along. Now that's being tested in cities like Lod, Lod is the prime example of where there's been no problems with Arab Israelis and Jews together. What you're finding now is for the first time, you're finding that there is actual violence between them, to the point of where there's been rioting in places like Lod. This is a picture behind me of a synagogue that Arabs burnt. Right, they burned down the synagogue in Lod. This is a man taking out a Sephardic Sefer Torah from the synagogue that Arabs burnt down. They burned cars, they burned schools, and they went through the streets, and there was violence. There's been Arabs that have been shot by Israeli citizens, and there's been just general violence, along with the fact that rockets are falling on them. It got to such a point that Bibi Netanyahu had to call in what what Americans might recognize as almost the National Guard. They had to bring in the army and police to man the streets en masse. And as we're talking about thousands of soldiers entering into a city to keep the peace after a state of emergency was declared. It is scary. I have friends that live in Lod. They're telling me that it's scary. There's fires on the streets. It's not a good place. This puts to test what we talked about earlier about the Ram Party and Mansour Abbas, which is an Arab-Israeli party, which ran on this platform of saying, we are going to set aside the Palestinian issue and look for it Arab-Israeli first. And even going so far as to say that they're welcome to join with Bibi Netanyahu, with Naftali Bennett in a right-wing government, which is traditionally hard on Palestinians, and being able to look past Palestinians to be able to do that. That's a huge move that was very surprising to people. And people were excited about this. They said, okay, finally, we've reached the point where Arab Israelis are putting Palestinians second and putting their own interests first. That's a practical step that we can see builds a future of Arab citizens and Israeli citizens together. Unfortunately, Mansour Abbas pulled out of negotiations, said it's improper to have negotiations with integrating into an Israeli government while this is happening, and he put the Palestinians back on the front burner, which again, if you talk about, when we talked about what brought us here, and we talked about internal Palestinian politics, this was I believe one of Hamas's goals was to make sure that this didn't happen. Now, why can't we just say that these are Arab protests? They're just demonstrations. The difference between a protest and a riot are signs. When you have a demonstration, you have a protest, people bring signs. They have chants that talk about a goal that they're trying to achieve. The chants in Lod are death to Jews. There are no signs. There's rocks. There's Molotov cocktails. They're burning synagogues. That's not a protest. That's a riot, and that's what's been happening. Okay, so that's the next thing that's been going on. If we go on to the next thing is the usual, unfortunately to use the word usual, but terrorism that's been happening. Okay, we've watched, in general, most people don't know this, but between 3 and 6 terrorist attacks or attempted terrorist attacks occur in Israel every single day. The reason why people don't know that is because it's just too much for the news. You can't have that in the news all the time, but that occurs almost all the time. Today, something that occurred in the news that barely made it into the news, you won't see it in any major publication except for small Israeli local publications, is that 2 of my neighbors were driving down the highway and saw a Palestinian and an Israeli soldier wrestling on the ground. They quickly pulled over to see what was happening, and the Palestinian had tried stabbing the soldier and then tried grabbing his gun. They were wrestling, and they were able to, thank God, neutralize the terrorists before anything bad happened. You won't even hear that in the news. What we've seen, and this made it into a viral video, is a lynching where Arabs saw right outside the old city, they saw a car driven by an Israeli driver stuck behind a bus, and they took the opportunity to go ahead and throw rocks at the car, causing the driver to lose control of the car, drive up on the side of the road, and then they tried killing him and tried lynching the driver. Today in Cholon, a man was stabbed. Outside of Nabi Musa, that's the incident I told you about before with my neighbors. There's been car rammings. There's been drive-by shootings that occurred earlier last week. And today the police stopped a shooting here in Yehuda Shomron. This is ongoing. It's connected. Once you start having violence, it leads to more and more violence. It leads to terrorism. And it's important to keep in mind that this is the Palestinian Authority incentivizing through its pay-to-slay programs Palestinians to look at terrorism as not just a viable option of a way of protest, but actually an honorable way of protesting and one that's financially lucrative. You can make a lot of money. A terrorist that conducts a successful terrorist attack will make 6 times as much money per month as a public school teacher in the Palestinian Authority system. So make your choice. Which would you rather do? Would you rather be a teacher and live in poverty, or make 6 times the amount for your family and be a terrorist? Once you have all the other factors coming together, it becomes very easy to become the terrorist. Okay, going on, we have what can we expect going forward, okay? So now, just to keep in mind that I'm not a prophet, I can't tell you 100% what's going to happen going forward, but this is what I think is easy enough to say, okay? The Jerusalem protests that we talked about at Har Bayis at the Temple Mount, I think that as Ramadan goes on, those will begin to dissipate. I think you'll see those as Ramadan ends next week, or maybe even this week. You'll see that less and less Muslims will be coming to the Temple Mount, right? They don't have to go to the Temple Mount to pray. Israel will deny most of the permits for Arabs to come to the Temple Mount because they'll want to keep things calmer. So I think that will begin to line up. You might have flashes depending on what's happening with Hamas, but for the most part, those will get less and less. Hamas with the rockets, that can go one of two ways. Okay, either it's going to just go away. Most of these flare-ups with rockets end after a day or two, but some lead to war. And that's the question. That's really going to be in Hamas's hands. Keep in mind, if Hamas would stop firing rockets right now, Israel would stop bombing Hamas targets right now. End point. That's it. That's all you have to know. So as long as Hamas keeps firing, Israel will keep hitting back to try to stop Hamas. That's the only calculation. So if Hamas wants to bring this to a bigger point, it's just going to keep firing rockets. Hamas knows that there's going to be a point where it crosses a line. There's no numbers, there's no metric, there's nothing that you could point to that says definitively that this is the line. If Hamas does X, then Israel will go to war. It's a decision that Bibi Netanyahu and Benny Gantz, as defense minister, are going to make as to when the line has been crossed. If anything major, God forbid, happens, if a rocket hits and creates a major incident, then you can expect all outright war. And when I say war, what's the difference between what's happening now and war? The difference comes down to one factor: ground forces. Whether Israel sends ground forces into Gaza. Right now, it's only using airplanes and drones, but tanks have been and are on their way right now to the Gaza front. There are 5,000 reservists that have been called up. That call up, every reservist that I've spoken to knows that they've been put on warning that they might be called up. They might be going into Gaza. The tanks are being lined up right now on the border with Gaza. Everybody knows that. Hamas sees that. If we know that, Hamas knows that. Okay, so that's what's happening. It's either going to simply go away and it ends almost immediately, or we're going to see a ground war. One other factor that might come into play is if Hamas is successful at completely overwhelming the Iron Dome system, where the Iron Dome system can no longer shield Israel from rockets, then Israel will have no choice but to heavily bomb Gaza. When we say heavily bomb Gaza, it will not be precise strikes. It will be within the area. They will not have the time nor the patience to be able to precisely hit where they think Hamas rocket launchers are, because it will not have that shield where they have the luxury of being able to say we're going to push this and not have to fight so hard. If Israel can't protect, then it's going to have to send in ground forces and it's going to have to bomb much heavier. Then you can expect many more casualties, into the thousands on the Gaza side, and you can expect, unfortunately, casualties as well on our side. I should say, unfortunately, on the Gaza side also, I wouldn't want, and I don't think anybody wants, innocent Gazans to die as well. We would all like this to end in peace. The anti-Israel riots throughout Israel, as soon as things begin to dissipate in Hamas and in Gaza and on the Temple Mount, then you'll see the Arab-Israel riots go down. What happens in the future, and this is incredibly important, I would say that this is probably the most important factor to look forward to look towards, is to see what is going to happen within Israeli society between Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews. We had seen that there was some sort of integration happening at an even greater level. We watched, as we mentioned a couple of times, Mansour Abbas and the Ram Party being able to say, okay, we're going to set aside tribal issues, and we're going to look forward just practically in a pragmatic fashion, what's best for our community. Now what we're seeing is, can I really trust my Israeli Arab neighbor? The guy that lives down the block from me, that I've called into my house all the time, where was he during all this violence? Was he passive? Did he sit back? Or was he one of the rioters? Can Israeli Arabs really trust, Israeli Jews really trust the Israeli Arab citizens after watching the violence that they've perpetrated over the last couple of days throughout Israel? That's a terrifying question because it means that we begin to look at 1/5 of our population as a fifth column. That is something very, very dangerous. But that's something that can cause a tremendous schism within the Israeli community. Terrorism will continue as it always has. It goes in waves. Sometimes there's a lot of terrorism, sometimes a little, but there's always a steady amount of terrorism. And again, that's because the Palestinian Authority incentivizes Palestinians to commit terror. Cannot stress that enough. That is the leading cause of terror among Palestinians. If there was no honor, if there was no lucrative financial incentive to go ahead and to commit terror among the Palestinians, there would be much less terror today. Lastly, Sheikh Jarrah and what's going to happen there. You'll see continued protests in Sheikh Jarrah. Those are minor skirmishes that don't lead to any serious violence, and let's hope that continues. That's been going on for years, and we hope that the Israeli Supreme Court, it's delayed its court case for another month to wait until the violence dies down, and we hope that will happen in a quieter fashion. That's the end of the briefing. I'm not going to take questions. You're more than welcome to send me any question that you want, and I will try to answer them. Thank you very much for joining, and let's hope for peace. And please, lastly, before you go, people have asked me what they can do. The first thing that they can do, which is the most important thing, is pray. I don't know how many people here regularly pray. If you pray 1 time a day, twice a day, 3 times a day, but now is the time to pray. The one being that can really solve all of these problems is God. The second thing that you can do, especially if you're an American citizen, is write to your member of Congress. Trust me, Palestinians are writing to their members of Congress and talking about the genocide that Israel is perpetrating in Gaza and in Jerusalem. You don't want them only hearing from one side. So please, very simple. I'm going to put it on my Facebook page later. Very simple. Just Google who is my member of Congress. It's going to ask you to put in your zip code and then just look up their website, and there's a form. It takes maybe 30 seconds, and all you have to write is, I am your constituent. I want you to speak out loudly in favor of Israel. That is it. Everybody, let's hope for peace in our days. Be'ezrat Hashem.